In this video, I will showcase some of the more advanced features of dynamic services. If you haven't watched the introductory video, please do so beforehand. This dynamic service provides an integration between Sophie and ServiceNow ticket platform. Through it, we can create tickets for incidents and requests using only a simple conversation with Sophie. First, I want to talk about the blocks that weren't used in the last video: the error handling block and the flow control block. The error handling block is used to define where Sophie must redirect to in case of an error occurring anywhere inside the Sophie dynamic service. It is highly recommended to use one before each HTTP request, since the endpoint might be down or unreachable. Using one before each HTTP request provides personalized messages for each type of request you're about to do. That way, we can know which part of the dynamic service failed. The flow control block, arguably the most important block, is used to allow the integration to make decisions based on gathered data. Here's an example to showcase the flow control block. Think of an air conditioning integration. The conversation flow within Sophie may ask for the room temperature, and then using a dynamic service, you can control whether the temperature needs to be increased or decreased based on your business logic. In this case, if the temperature is above 30, the dynamic service will follow the flow to the decreased temperature block. If the temperature is below 20, it will go to the increased temperature block. If it's not any of those, it will go to the exit flow. Back in the ServiceNow integration, we can see that the flow control blocks are mostly used to check if the response from the server is returning the required information. For example, after checking the user with the find user HTTP request, we can use a flow control block to check the data return contains the sysID that we'll later use to create the calls, the incidents, the orders, and all the other parts of the ticket. Now we can recognize a pattern. We always have a error handling block, then we have a HTTP request, then we have a flow control block to check if the data received is correct and according to what you would expect. This block repeats many times throughout the integration. We can see it here, 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 and here. It's highly recommended that we use this pattern. We only have a single control block used for business logic, which in this case is to check whether the ticket that we must open is an incident report or item request call, in which case the flow must go on with slightly different parameters than the other. Another thing worth mentioning is the new parameters that we are using in this integration, such as network credentials, which are required by the ServiceNow API. Also, we make use of dynamic data and static data on these requests, and we also use all types of HTTP methods: GET, POST, and PUT. These are the three currently implemented HTTP methods. We are also using variables in our URLs, such as this item ID, which we got from the user conversation flow. These are all features that weren't showcased in the first video. Lastly, I want to talk about flow control condition ordering and default choice selection. As you can see, my third condition has no expression. That is because the last condition is always the default one. Therefore, if none of the expressions are true, the dynamic service will always choose the last condition. That means that we don't need all F's to have an expression, or have a obviously true expression to serve as a default condition. We can also see that many of these condition blocks check for new values on their expressions. That is because dynamic services, when they try to access unavailable properties in variables, they return null instead of yielding an error and falling in the error handling block. That way we can have better control of whether the property that you need were returned or not, and then act accordingly using your own business logic. Now that we've talked about the new parameters in this dynamic service, I want to take a moment to explain what it actually does. The first step is to gather all the required information from the client context. That is done using the start event. Then we have to validate if the current Sophie user actually exists in the ServiceNow database. And according to the ServiceNow API documentation, that is done using a GET request. Now, if the HTTP request doesn't fail and the API returns a valid user, then we can proceed to create a ticket. At this point, we branch into two types of tickets: request tickets, which are for requesting new hardware or software, and incident reports, which are open when some software or hardware malfunctions. For a request ticket, there's two main steps to it. First, we need to create the call using the parameters required in the documentation, and then creating an order attached to this request, identifying exactly what item do you need. If both requests are successful and they return valid data, then the flow will run successfully and then return to Sophie with the ticket ID. For incidents, there are also two steps. The first one is to create the incidents call, also according to the documentation. After call is created with the incident type, ServiceNow will automatically create a new incident item attached to this call, but it will have default parameters. Therefore, we need a second step to update this incident with the client data. And because this is an update, the documentation says that we need to use a put request. Again, if all requests reach successfully their APIs and all the returned data is valid, then we can proceed to a successful exit and also display the ticket number. Now I can export the diagram and import in Knowledge Manager. Then we need to publish integrations. As you can see, most of the rules required by the dynamic service are already created. We only need to create the open incident rule. Let's create it together. Now we only need to test the flow to make sure it works. Let's make sure this incident actually exists on ServiceNow. And here it is.